morning today, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest this afternoon, Louise Mackay. She's the wife of Comstock Lode Silver Baron John Mackay. She speaks 4 languages. She is known for her quick wit, her generosity, and her charm. She has entertained a president, foreign diplomats, and European royalty. But her main focus has always been her husband, her children, and her extended family. The Mackays' relationship allowed them to pursue their own dreams. Their love grew deeper over time, and Louise calls it, quote, an unexpected happiness that lasted. Please welcome Louise Mackay.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about my family and my husband. You know him as the Bonanza King, and I know that the thing that John Mackay was most proud of was his reputation, one of integrity. He wanted no man to be able to say that they had been shortchanged by John Mackay. So that's the story that I will tell you today. We had so many things in common. First of all, we're both New Yorkers. I was born there in 1863. All right, it was 1843. Keep it to yourself. And he and his family emigrated from just outside of Dublin, Ireland in 1840. He was about 9 at the time. And we only lived 1.5 miles from one another. And we were both poor. But the level of poverty for the Mackays was almost indescribable. They took up rooms on Frankfurt Street in the most notorious slum in the United States, called 5 Points. When John was 11 years old, his father died, and he had to quit work and get a job, and so he did. He worked for the New York Herald, hawking newspapers and fighting for the best corners in New York City. He was a pugnacious young boy. He had a heavy lisp, and John understood and knew people better than anyone I've ever known. Somehow when he was 15, he managed to get a job at the William Webb shipyard. They proudly displayed a placard that said, all colors are welcome. Irish need not apply. They were the vermin of St. Patrick. But John had a way about him, and he got a 5-year apprenticeship, and he filled it out dutifully, even though he wanted to leave for the gold rush earlier. He finished his apprenticeship, got on a ship, and came out to California, and ended up around the Yuba River, where he worked in many, many mines, placer mining, in and around the Yuba River. My father was a barber, a soldier, and a dreamer. He left New York 2 times when I was little. The first time was to go to fight in Mexico, and the second time was to find gold in California, in Downeyville. My grandmother, Madame Louise Mackay de la Fraser, said that when your father put down his razor and picked up his sword, your mother and I picked up our needles and our scissors. And that's what they did. They sewed for the rich people, the rich ladies of St. John's Park. They did undergarments, silk undergarments that were richly embroidered. My mother was a gifted embroiderer. And it was my secret dream from then on to be a lady when I grew up and to have my own key to St. John's Park. So John Major Hungerford sent for us when I was 10 years old, and we made the great trip. We went from New York Harbor all the way around to Aspinwall, Panama, And from there we took a train, and from there we rode donkeys to the Pacific coast. And once there, we got on a steamer. And that's where I met Louise Althea Meyer. Her family was traveling to Downeyville too. And a little boy who was kind of rough, and she was younger than me, grabbed her doll and snapped its head off. And I ran after him, punched him in the face, and got the doll back from her. And we've been best friends ever since. I'm a New Yorker. John mined around the Yuba River for about 7 years. And then when it was played out and he wasn't making grub, he and his partner, Jack O'Brien, heard about a lode in a place called Virginia, and they decided to go there. They walked from Downeyville area all over the Sierras to Virginia. They had everything they owned on their back and not a dime in their pockets. And when they got there, John got 2 jobs. He always had 2. The first one, he worked as a miner for $4 a day. And the second one, a full-time job, he worked for feet. The way you got stock in a mining company, in a mine, was by feet. If the mine was 400 feet wide, why then there were 400 feet to be sold. So that is the way that he started it. His first partner, Jack O'Brien, hated hard rock mining, and he headed back east. He had a second partner whose name was Jim Walker, Jonas Walker actually, and they teamed up. Neither one of them drank very much, and they only allowed themselves an occasional cigar, and they didn't live in a rooming house, they lived in a dugout. And when money got low, it was always John Mackay who had a few dollars set aside to buy food that he would share with his partner and his friends. By some crazy luck, they got a hold of this small mine. It was called the Kentuck. It was a rat hole of a mine. It was less than 400 feet. And it was a miracle that they got it. They almost lost it on the way. It is a great story. But on New Year's Day, 1866, they hit pay dirt. And from then on, John Mackay worked just as hard. He never stopped working. He always had the 2 jobs. Back in Downeyville, my father scraped up enough money to send me to St. Catherine's Female Academy at Benicia for the half year. And at the very end of July, he came and he got me, brought me home, and I could never go back. It seems there were some setbacks. There were some fines that were unpaid, and then there was further fines on those fines, and then there was like a little disturbance of the peace thing. So they were not in the position to send me to school again. And my mother was having a late-age pregnancy, and I needed to help her. My sister, Ada, beautiful Ada, was born in October, pardon me, and I took care of her. There was a giant fire in January of '58. We all had to leave our homes and run up into the hills. My mother had to help my grandmother, and I was in charge of Ada. And during those 2 days, I held her and I told her I would find a way when she grew up to make her a lady, to have her have the education that she wanted, and to only wear beautiful clothes. My grandmother got sick that night, and she never really recovered. She died that winter. And in the spring, my father brought home a gentleman. His name was Mr. Bryant, Dr. Bryant, Edmund Bryant. He was charming. He was handsome. He was educated. He had graduated Columbia. And he was from Brooklyn. He was a New Yorker. What was I waiting for, you know? So I married him 11 days after I turned 16. And we were really very happy at first. He was well respected. Everyone liked Edmund. And he was in charge of the hospital there. And in November of the following year, we welcomed our first child, Eveline. I named her after the kindest woman I've ever known, my mother. Things change quickly in a mining town. One day it's good and then it's not. And pretty soon, the Hungerfords left for Virginia. And then the Bryants left for Virginia. I stayed back to sell a few things that we owned. But I was determined to make a go of it in Virginia City, just like my mother had in Downeyville. And at first, it was great. It was the good times. But then very quickly, we had another depression. My mother and father and sister went to San Francisco. My husband went to the Reese River, and I moved from 10A Street to Mrs. Mock's boarding house. I took smaller quarters. They were less expensive. And at the same time, my 8-month-old daughter, Marie, died of septic sore throat. And Father Minogue had to do a collection so that we could bury her. At the same time, he offered me a job at St. Mary's as a piano teacher. I was one of the worst piano teachers they ever had. But I needed the money. I could barely stay ahead of the kids. But he also introduced me to the wealthy ladies of Virginia City, and I sewed for them. And Teresa Fair was one of them. We also shared a pew together. When Edmund came home from Reese River, he was disappointed. He was angry. He was dissipated and penniless. And it was no secret in Virginia that he had succumbed to the drink. In all fairness, I think he tried to tell me about the other, but I just didn't understand. He said he had succumbed to the weakness of doctors. He was using opium. I didn't understand and I didn't ask. My daughter had a terrible accident, which left her lame for the rest of her life. And Edmund left for San Francisco right after that. I didn't hear from him for 2 years. No one knew where he was. But finally, Father Minogue got word of him. He was up in a place called Poverty Hill. And I thought I could help him. I was 22. I thought I could do anything. I thought I could get there and I could nurse him back to health. And I asked for my father to join me, which he did. And he was by my side when we buried him. He died a horrific death of lockjaw. And he was buried there. But I told my father that I wanted that obituary to say not one word about the drugs. Edmund was a good man. He lost his way. He got off track. But I didn't want his daughter to ever read anything that would cause her to bend her head or not feel proud. And I returned to Virginia City. My father went home to to San Francisco, and about 3 days later, 3 men showed up in Mrs. Mock's parlor. They had all known Edmund from the Masonic Lodge in Forest City. It was the Rosner brothers and this guy, John Mackay. They had taken up a collection for me to tide me over. But I told them, I don't want your money. I do not want this. I don't want your charity. There's something you can do for me, but I'm not taking your money. And you could hear a pin drop. The Irishman stepped forward and he said, "You're saying, Mom, that there was something? You only have to say it, and we'll do it for you." And I told the Rosner brothers that I wanted to be able to do the alterations for the ladies who bought ready-made clothing at their store, and they allowed me to. And that John Mackay happened to be the John Mackay who everyone said was the up-and-coming man of the Comstock. Well, he sure didn't look like it. But Teresa Fair went to work and invited me over to her house with my daughter on Christmas Day, and Jim Fair had his friend Jim Mackay there. And Mr. Mackay was so kind to my daughter. My shy, quiet daughter, in a very short amount of time, was laughing and bobbing on John's knee, and afterwards he walked us home and we began to quietly date. And in the spring, he made me an offer, and Jim Fair took me aside and said, "Look, this is never going to happen again. This is a once in a million. If you pass this up, you are a fool, and you'll never get this chance again. And that daughter of yours could have a father who loved her." So I respected John. I admired John, and I knew in my heart that a woman would always be safe with John. And you can imagine, safety was a big one for me at that time. So I just simply told John that. I didn't dress it up. I said it very plainly. And he said, he laughed. He laughed and he said, "Well, that's a good start." And so we were married by Father Minogue at St. Mary's, November 25th, 1867. And Jim and Teresa stood up for us. Then we moved into a beautiful house on the corner of Taylor and, was Taylor and Howard Streets. Yes, that's right. It was, I could do anything. John said I could buy anything for it. That was really fun. But the best thing is that he invited my mother and my sister and my father, whenever he was around, to come and live with us. And we had a parlor. And none of us had ever had a parlor before. You know, a parlor is just this room where you go and the only purpose is you sit there. It was magic for us. We had great years there. We went to the opera so many times with John. He loved entertainment like that. And then a couple of years later, I had good news of my own. We were going to have a baby. We were going to have a baby in August. John said it was a boy. I said, "You don't know that." And he said, "No, it's a boy." And it was a boy. But he sent us, as soon as he knew I was having a child, he sent me and all of his ladies, as he called us, off to the Grand Hotel in San Francisco, because Virginia was rough. Virginia was noisy beyond belief. And while I was there, I was to look for specialists to help my daughter, Eva. And so John William Mackay Jr. was born on August 12th, 1870. John was ecstatic. And I was so proud. You might think I recreated the world. That's how proud I was. I finally had given him something that he really wanted, that he wanted the most. But there was no help for Eva. The doctors in San Francisco said it was not anything that they could do. So back we went to Virginia, and at Christmas time, John suggested that we take Eva and all of us, the entire family, to Europe, to France. He had heard of a special doctor there. There was hope. But we were going to call it a grand tour because we didn't want the child to have any expectations or feel like she let us down in any way. So we did go, and we met the doctor at the end of the summer. Apparently in France, they take the whole summer off. Very civilized. So when he came back, he said she wasn't in shape for it, that we should spend the winter rather, in the Riviera, and she needed to grow healthier, which she did. John, of course, had to go back to Virginia, and he came back in, I think the end of July in the following year, in '73. Eva had her operation, and I told everybody it was a success, but it wasn't. When John came, I was able to tell him the truth. And I just planned different things for my daughter. I hired dressmakers who could drape the clothing so the limping wouldn't show. I gave her dance lessons and a lot of hope. And John had a big secret of his own. That man was tight-lipped. He didn't even write it to me in a letter. They had made the Bonanza, the big time. We were incredibly rich. It was very amazing. It was hard to imagine. We were already great. And in August, I had news for him. We were going to have another baby. He said it was a boy. It was. So in April 17th of '74, I had Clarence Hungerford Mackay, and we were just a very happy family. We returned home. I lived now in San Francisco. He bought us a home on a Farrell Street, and I came to Virginia only one more time in my life, and I went down in the mine with John to see the silver, because I was planning to have a silver service made, and I had some big ideas about it. And that was the last time I went to Virginia. We went to New York, and I was rejected. The Knickerbockers laughed at me. We were Catholic, we were Irish, and my husband had worked with his hands at one time in his life, if you can imagine. I was humiliated, and I barely held my face without crying. And John said, "You can live anywhere in the world. Pick a place, pick any place, and I'll be there right beside you." So I chose the most beautiful city that I had ever seen, Paris. And the whole bunch of us went to Paris. And within 3 days of being there, John found a house for us. Well, it wasn't really a house. It was a mansion, 9 Rue de Tilset. My mother, father, and sister had their own suite of rooms. It was enormous. And I finally got my opportunity to become a hostess when ex-president Ulysses S. Grant was doing a world tour. And through John's connection, they managed to get me the last party of the last week. And I did it up. It was fantastic. I still have all the newspaper clippings, you know. Who's going to throw those away? It was just wonderful. We had great years there. My sister Ada got the education I promised, and she married Joseph Telfiner, who was a count, and he was a wonderful guy, and they had 4 children and a great marriage. My daughter Eva became a princess. She married an Italian, Colonna, Prince of Galatro. It was a horrible marriage. They had 3 children, a son, a daughter, then another son, and then they got a divorce. My innocent and sweet daughter was devastated, and her father took care of the divorce. After that, John said he was going to retire. This is about 1881, and I was thrilled. He was going to turn 50 that year. So I thought this was wonderful. We could enjoy our life, go all over the place, and we did that for 2 years. And then President Arthur asked John to represent the United States at the coronation of Alexander III of Russia. And so we went to the coronation, and it was unbelievable. I mean, I've never seen such wealth, such jewelry, even the jewelry that I had, and I had remarkable jewelry, barely stood up to what they were wearing. And everything was glamorous about their palaces and their everything. But there was this uneasy feeling, and I couldn't place it at first. Demotier, my personal maid, who is still with me now, only she's not a maid, she's my companion, said a very astute thing. She said, "Here the masters are all. The people are nothing. They are not even slaves. They're not even animals. The handsome horses are more." It's true. That is the feeling. These people thought of themselves as more godlike than royal. I was dying to get back to Paris, and on the way we had private cars that John had arranged for us, our own cars, and he said that he and Gordon Bennett were going to partner up and against Jay Gould, who was the most hated man in the United States. He was a double dealer, a swindler. He broke men without a thought. And so that's what they were going to do. The cable wars took about 5 years, but John and Gordon were victorious. And during that time, shortly after that time, we lost our son, our first son. He was a graduate of Oxford. He had been working with his father for a couple of years in New York, and this was just a vacation in France. And he died, and our world came to a screeching halt. I know there are probably some of you out here who've had that experience, but it is one that we learned to deal with, but neither one of us ever really got over it. And that's really all I can say about it. Even after all of these years, it is more than I can handle. It's like there's always a pit there, and if I go too close to it, I feel I'll fall through. Willie had to take over, and he wasn't prepared, and at first his father didn't even act like he was standing there. But gradually, they got on. And Willie, and Clary did his best, but it's not what Clary was trained for. Clary married a beautiful debutante by the name of Catherine Dorr. She was a New York socialite and debutante. And as a wedding gift, John gave him a mansion to be built to Catherine's specifications called Harbor Hill. They had 3 children, but the only child John ever held was the first one, always called Kay. And I'll never forget the look on that man's face when he held that child. Now, Clary wants me to come home to America. I still have my place in England, but I spend a lot of time in Paris because I see Eva there, and then I visit her on the Riviera, the Italian Riviera, and her daughter Bianca is married to a wonderful French man. So I have them there. I have choices, and it's nice to have those choices. I think I'm a very lucky person. You know what? It is so nice for me to share my memories with you. I thank you for the opportunity. It makes me feel lighter, even if I tell you about some of the dark days. I am very grateful to have had a life with such a wonderful family and a man who showed me what partnership really is, a man I deeply loved. Thank you for listening. Now, do you have any questions for me? I've been doing all this talking. Okay.
Where did your husband die?
He died on the steps of our home in England. And so he had a heart attack on the 15th of July at 6 Cheris Place. And in 3 days, he was gone. Then it was my turn. I had a heart attack. Yes?
What was your favorite part about living in France?
The parties. The parties, the balls. Little Mamie Hungerford from Downeyville, California, dancing with princes and entertaining royalty. I enjoyed thinking of that. Yes?
Your bio said that you spoke 4 languages. Where did you acquire that?
Well, my grandmother, Louise de la Fraser, spoke 2 languages, French and Spanish. And then, since Eva was in Italy and my grandchildren were Italian, I finally learned Italian.
You mentioned a friend that you met on coming across the Panama Canal. Would you tell us a little bit about her?
Louise Althea Meyer? Oh, yes. She still is a friend of my lifetime. Whenever I'm around the San Francisco area, I see her. We have always kept in touch through the ages. She made a wonderful marriage to a man by the name of Bob Howland. She's very happy, and even if we're separated for 20 years, it's an hour before we're really back, in sync. My husband asked me to move to either London or New York because the cable started in England and it went to New York City. So I chose London, and then I sent my children there. So, yes? No?
This isn't a question, this is more of a statement. While you lived in France, a wonderful book was written by a Frenchman that used you as the basis of the character.
Oh my goodness.
A beautiful, gracious American woman comes to a small French village, and they're worried that the new family will not support the abbey, the small church that's there. It's a lovely children's book written for French children learning.
Oh my gosh.
And we used to.
I'll have to get that name.
We say hello to our Chautauquan today.
We're not too
Now I'm Veronica.
Who wrote the book about Louise Mackay?
Her granddaughter,
Her granddaughter.
Ellen Berlin. She married Irving Berlin. And her father, Clary, disowned her for a while. But they forgot about it. Everybody kissed and made up. And their marriage lasted a lifetime. He was much older than she was, and he had already kind of made it big, but she died before him. Yes?
Speak to the philanthropy that
I can't hear you.
That Mackay was so important for here in Washoe County in Reno with the university.
The philanthropy. The money.
Yes. Clary did that. John gave very generously, but he always anonymously. So that is one reason that I think history has kind of overlooked him, is because he never thought to do that. Clary, I think it was 1908, along with Louise, but Louise never saw the campus or the statue.
Can you talk about the silver?
Oh, yes. The silver was amazing. It was 9 chests that came to Paris. It took 2 years. It took 4 men to carry each one of the chests. And it's still on show at one of the museums here. I can't think of the name of the museum, but it is beautiful. What? Oh, yes. Well worth seeing. It was enormous. And the heft of it was something that I think a man would appreciate more than a woman. I mean, it's very heavy. But it's all split up now. Yes, 200 people at Tiffany's, yeah. I can't hear you. Yes, the big expedition. And that is where electricity was introduced. That is where some of Marie's new jewels were introduced. And that is where the gentleman who created the Statue of Liberty was working on the head at that time.
I also wanted to mention that you're
Thank you.
Your home in Paris became an embassy, and your home in London became the International Tea Society.
Yes. The Rue de Tilset is the Belgium embassy. So, yes?
Veronica, how long did it take you to research this character?
Well, when I started, I knew zero. You know, I had been to 5 classes, and I just picked someone that I liked. I didn't realize that in order to know Louise, you had to know her husband, and then, you know, they touched the lives of so many people of the 19th century and then the 20th century. So it was an enormous amount of stuff. The greatest book on it is the one called Bonanza King. That's an amazing book, but that is very technical. It's a lot about the mines, and it has some great stories about the bank ring and how they try to swindle everybody out of their money. And John avoided that. He opened a bank in Nevada. I mean, a bank called the Nevada Bank. You know, they also had a hard time processing the gold, so they opened their own processing plant. They did everything that the major crowd did, and they did it many times knowing they could lose everything until that big strike.
In your reading, I really like Louise Mackay, so I read anything I can find on her.
I do too.
But in your study of it, Dr. Bryant is either said that he's a dentist or he's an MD, and I didn't know at that time, did they do both?
Well, I think the mix-up there is he was a graduate of Columbia, and he was a surgeon. He was the chief surgeon in the Downeyville Hospital. Excuse me. But a lot of barbers did dentistry back then. They pulled teeth. And that is how Bryant and old Mr. and Hungerford met each other. So he would come in, you know, and help show him something about pulling a tooth or something, because that was the sideline of barbers in those days. We good?
No.
Okay.
Some writers say that Dr. Bryant, the lack of care caused his daughter's accident. Is that how his great-grandchild would have?
I think he did personally, because of circumstances. Louise was out fitting a new lady, and he was home. He had just come home from the Reese River, and he was in a foul mood, and he was drinking and using, and Eva was allegedly kind of a whiny child, and she fell backwards down a flight of stairs, and Mrs. Mock was there, and Mrs. Mock never liked Dr. Bryant after that, and the little girl wouldn't go to him. You know, she would hobble after her mother. She wouldn't go to him. So that is my feeling. But Louise would have rather choked on anything rather than say that. She never wanted her to have any bad feelings, and, you know, a picture of her dad was always in her room, and, you know, she kept Bryant as her middle name because she had a hard time in this world. You know, she was not the prettiest of children, and she had that limp, but she was the sweetest of children.
Thank you for your research. It's very nice.
Thank you.